The freighter Alden Moore's Grace died on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not with fire visible across a system. It died the way most things die in deep space, quietly, without witnesses, in the dark between stars, where no one was watching, and the cold does not care about timelines or cargo manifests, or the 17 people who had packed their personal belongings into the crew quarters 6 weeks earlier, and were looking forward to making port. A stress fracture in the secondary pressure coupling of the port drive assembly, a fracture that had been flagged by automated scanner at the Mirani Standards dock on Velix Station 41 days prior, a fracture that had been classified as within acceptable tolerances, sealed with a grade C polymer bond, cleared for transit. The fracture completed itself approximately 9 hours into the final leg of the journey. The Alden Moore's Grace was not the first. This is the part the galaxy did not want to understand, and then could not stop understanding once the numbers were finally placed in the same room at the same time. It was not the first. Auditor Magistrate Soren Val received the commission on a morning that felt ordinary. The Delvari were meticulous record keepers by nature, 6 fingers on each hand, each one used, it was often said, for a different category of detail, and Val was considered exceptional even among his species. He had audited 17 stations in 30 years of service. He had found 11 significant discrepancies. He had never found anything he would describe as impossible. The file his commission attached was titled, in the dry language of the Galactic Concordate Standards Bureau, Transit Survival Variance Study, Tertiary Corridor Networks, Cycles 40-47. He read it 3 times. Then he set it down and looked at his window for a long time. The numbers were not dramatic on their face. Numbers rarely were. Post-repair critical failure rates across the tertiary corridor networks averaged 4.7% over the study period. Some stations ran higher, some ran lower, normal distribution. The kind of variance that produced academic papers and quarterly reviews and very little actual change. But one facility was not in the distribution. One facility posted a post-repair critical failure rate of 0.3% across the same 8-cycle period, across more than 1,400 documented repairs. Across species, hull types, drive configurations, and damage classifications ranging from minor cosmetic to catastrophic structural, 0.3. Vale pulled the facility profile, a human cooperative operating out of a converted ore processing platform on the outer edge of the Varant Transit Corridor, officially classified as a Class C independent repair facility, crew complement of 31. Equipment inventory that the Standards Bureau had flagged, twice, as aging but operational. No galactic certification above Class C, no corporate backing, no research division, no explanation. He booked transport the following morning. The first thing Val noted about Cradle Station, the cooperative's unofficial name, stenciled in both Galactic Standard and what he would later learn was a human language called Portuguese, was that it did not look like a place that should be saving lives. It looked like a place that had been saving its own life for several decades, and was doing so successfully but not elegantly. Paneling on the outer ring showed 3 distinct generations of repair material. The docking arms had clearly been extended at some point, twice, from the seam patterns welded at angles that suggested improvisation rather than planning. Signal lights blinked in what a rigorous engineer might charitably describe as a pattern. Val's assistant, the Sarath archivist Pelin, clicked her mandibles softly as their transport docked. This was her equivalent of raised eyebrows. "The statistical data is correct?" she asked. It was not quite a question. "The statistical data is always correct," Val said. "The explanation for the statistical data is what we're here to find." They were met at the airlock by a human woman who was wiping her hands on a cloth that had probably been white at some point in its existence. She was somewhere in her middle years. Difficult to read in humans, Val knew, since they aged at rates that varied significantly by individual, with gray coming into dark hair and eyes that assessed him the way a structural engineer assesses a bridge, professionally, without judgment, looking for the load-bearing elements. "Magistrate Val," she said. "Dara Moss. I run the cooperative." She looked at his formal audit robes and said, without any particular inflection, "We got your advance notice. Wasn't sure what to do differently, so we just kept working. Hope that's all right." It was, he would later think, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to an auditor. Dara Moss gave them access to everything, not in the way facilities usually granted access: controlled tours, curated data pools, a representative from legal standing slightly too close. She handed Pelin a data key and said, "That's everything. Logs, repair records, material inventories, crew hours, internal communications. If you need something you can't find, ask anyone." Then she went back to work. Val spent the first day observing. This was his methodology. Before pulling records, before interviewing witnesses, before forming hypotheses, he watched. It had served him well for 30 years. People and organizations revealed themselves in the texture of ordinary work. What he observed at Cradle Station was, by any reasonable standard, disorganized. Work crews moved between jobs without the structured handoff protocols mandated by galactic standards. Engineers consulted each other constantly, not through formal channels, through shouting across bays and walking over mid-task to look at something together. Repair logs were updated in real time by whoever was closest to a terminal, which meant the handwriting, human handwriting, still used here in physical form, an artifact Vale found deeply strange, changed mid-document, and yet, the Sundancer, a Keth commercial hauler docked in Bay 3, had arrived 4 days prior with a compromised reactor containment sheath. By galactic standards, the repair required 72 hours. Vale watched 3 human engineers finish it in 41. He pulled the repair log to check for shortcuts. There were none. There were in fact additions. Reinforcement of 2 adjacently stressed bulkheads, replacement of a coolant valve that the log noted was technically functional, but making the wrong sound. Recalibration of the ship's internal monitoring system to higher sensitivity settings than the manufacturer's specifications. None of these additions were in the contracted scope. None of them had been billed. Val stood in Bay 3 for a long time with the repair log in his hands. The engineer's name was Tomas Reyes, and he was the one who had written "making the wrong sound" in the log. Val found him the next morning in Bay 7, working on the underside of a small Delvari cargo runner with a precision scanner held loosely in one hand. He was not scanning anything with it. He had his eyes closed. "You're not using the scanner," Val observed. Reyes opened one eye. "I'm using it, just not the active mode." He tapped it. "Sometimes you run the passive sensor alongside you while you're moving, and you feel the variance. The weight of it in your hand changes when the sensor's picking up something. My hands notice before I do." Val looked at the scanner, then at the engineer's hands. "That is not a documented diagnostic technique." "No," Reyes agreed pleasantly. "It's a technique my sister's supervisor taught her, and she taught me. He learned it from a woman who learned it from the engineer who first certified this scanner model, who apparently knew things about it that didn't make it into the manual. He moved to a new position under the hull. Standard scan would have told you this section is fine. It is fine, but there's a micro fracture developing 3 layers and it won't show on imaging for another 4 months. It'll fail in 7. Val crouched to look. "How certain are you about the fracture?" "Certain enough to spend the next 3 hours fixing it." Reyes glanced at him sideways. "This is a courier ship. Owner uses it for medical supply runs to the Keth outer colonies. 7 months from now, if that fracture completes, there's a decent chance the cargo gets there and the owner doesn't." He went back to work. "So, we fix it now. The contract does not cover." "Yeah." Reyes said it without rancor, without any particular emotion at all. "I know." Pelin found Val in the cooperative's small administrative block that evening. She had spent the day in the records, which was what she preferred. The Surath processed information through precise pattern mapping, her species' particular gift, and what she had found in Cradle Station's archives had produced by her expression the equivalent of vertigo. She laid 3 data panes on the table. "Failure rate comparison," she said. Cradle Station Cooperative, matched against 12 certified repair facilities of equivalent or superior classification rating, same corridor, same 8-cycle period. Val studied the panes. The gap was not subtle. It was not a matter of professional pride or statistical hair-splitting. It was the difference between a number that was acceptable and a number that was not. 4.7%, galactic average. Facilities that had been certified, inspected, approved, recommended. Facilities with proper equipment, inventories, and graduated staff certifications, and legal departments, and public-facing quality assurance statements, 0.3%. One facility, 31 people, old equipment, an unofficial name stenciled over the door. If you extrapolate the galactic average failure rate across all repairs conducted by certified facilities in the tertiary corridor during this period, Pelin said carefully, the expected mortality from post-repair failures is approximately 940 individuals. She paused. The actual recorded mortality is 612. Another pause. The gap, 328 individuals, is what the Cradle Station survival rate applied across the corridor would have saved. She set down the 3rd pane. These are not people who died at Cradle Station. These are people who died because they were not repaired at Cradle Station. The room was very quiet. "Who has seen this analysis?" Val asked. "No one. I ran it independently." Pellin's mandibles were still. "Magistrate, I have been an archivist for 22 years. I have never encountered a variance this significant. This is not an outlier. This is Val, and..." She paused. Unusual for her, this is an indictment. Captain Yessa Unner arrived at Cradle Station the following morning. Not as a witness. Val had not yet requested her, but as a repeat client. Her merchant vessel, the Hollow Point, settled into Bay 2 with the familiar ease of a ship that had been in a specific place before. Val intercepted her at the airlock. The Keth were aquatic bipeds, evolved from a coastal lineage, amber-eyed, with a slight iridescence to their skin that served in their original habitat as a social signal. Captain Unner's iridescence had the quality of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had settled into it. She agreed to speak with him. She seemed unsurprised that he was there. 2 years ago, she said, I came through the corridor with a hairline fracture in my main drive manifold. Small. Certified with intolerance at Velik Station 3 weeks before. Passed 2 additional inspections. She looked at the hollow point in the bay. I stopped here because I was behind on my delivery schedule and Cradle was closer than my next planned stop. I didn't expect much. Class C facility. What happened? One of their engineers, young one, second cycle I think, ran her scanner over the manifold for about 40 minutes longer than anyone else ever had. Then she sat down on the bay floor and looked at it for another 20 minutes. Just looked. Captain Unner's amber eyes were steady. Then she came to me and told me the fracture had a propagation pattern consistent with thermal fatigue in the underlying alloy. Not the fracture itself, the alloy. She showed me the spectral analysis. The fracture was within tolerance. The alloy was not going to remain within tolerance. Val waited. If I had continued on my scheduled route, I would have hit the narrow. The high radiation transit zone 3 jumps out. The thermal load would have accelerated the propagation. The manifold would have failed in transit. She said it without drama. My crew complement at the time was 12. There's no rescue infrastructure in the narrow. What did the Cradle Cooperative charge for the additional analysis? Captain Unner looked at him. Nothing. They said it fell under the initial inspection. The repair itself they billed at standard rates. She paused. I asked the engineer why she'd spent the extra time. She said the manifold felt young for its age, which I did not understand. She explained that the alloy composition was older than the manifold's installation date, which meant it had probably been in storage or reprocessed. Different fatigue characteristics than nominal. She'd learned that from an engineer twice her age who'd repaired a ship with the same alloy type and told her to always check the composition, not just the certification date. She looked at the bay. I've brought the hollow point back here 4 times since. I've sent 7 colleagues. 2 of them found problems nobody else had caught. She shrugged, Keth style, a ripple across the shoulder iridescence. I trust them. That's rare. That's worth more than proximity. Dara Moss found Vol in the bay observation deck on the 4th evening. He had been standing there for approximately 90 minutes. She appeared to have been working. There was a faint smell of coolant on her, but she leaned on the railing beside him without asking if he wanted company and looked at the active bays below. 3 ships in various states of repair, crews moving in the low constant rhythm of work that did not stop when the lights cycled to evening mode. You have questions, she said. It was not quite a statement. Many, Val admitted. I will start with one. The additional work your engineers perform, the unrequested, unbilled repairs. I have documented 23 instances in the past 4 days alone. The material costs come out of cooperative funds. The labor hours extend shifts beyond regulation. You are aware of this? Yes. I cannot determine whether this represents a compliance violation or simply an unusual business practice. But my deeper question is, he stopped. Why? Dara Moss was quiet for a moment. Below, an engineer was replacing a coupling that had not been in any work order Val had seen. When I was 26, she said finally, my husband was working on a long-haul cargo run, 17 weeks out. His ship had been through a certified station, good rating, major corporate affiliation, all the standards marks. She looked fine. She was fine on paper. She paused. He made port. The run after that, the coupling they'd repaired failed, not catastrophically. Just enough. He lived. 3 of his crewmates didn't. Val said nothing. I became an engineer because I couldn't stop thinking about the coupling, about why it failed, about what someone would have needed to catch, and I kept finding it. The answer was always the same. Someone had done enough. Not more. Enough. She looked at her hands. Enough is a kind of choice. Enough means This is as much as the contract requires, and I have decided the contract is the ceiling. She shook her head. For us, the contract is the floor. The floor is not a ceiling. Below, the engineer finished replacing the coupling, made a note in the log, moved to the next task. When one of our people works on a ship, Dara said, they know that ship is going somewhere, into the narrow, out to a colony, to a system where if something fails, there's no help for 6 days. They know that. They carry that. She was quiet for a moment. Grief is a good teacher. We've all lost someone. To space, to bad repairs, to the gap between what should have been done and what was done. We remember. We take that into the bay with us every shift. That's what you're seeing. Not policy. Memory. Val looked at the repair bays for a long time. Show me something, he said at last. Anything. Whatever you think I need to see. She took him to a room he had not found in his tour. Small, off the main residential corridor. The walls were covered in plates, metal plates, ceramic tiles, salvaged hull panels, each one engraved or painted or etched with a name, ship names, and beneath them, smaller, crew numbers, sometimes names, sometimes just a count. The Sorrow Distant 8 aboard, Caravan's End 23 aboard, Yellen Bright 4 aboard. There were hundreds. These are ships we couldn't save, Dara said. Ships that came here too damaged. Ships that left here fine and died in something we couldn't have predicted. Ships we heard about after. She moved along the wall. We add them when we learn about them. Doesn't matter how they went. They were ships. They carried people. We knew them, or we knew ships like them, and they mattered. Val studied the wall. His 6-fingered hands trained to count, to quantify, to find the numerical truth in any data set, were very still. Other facilities do not do this, he said. Not that I've seen. Why? Dara turned to look at him. Her expression was not quite sad. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone who has processed grief into something functional. Because if you let yourself remember the ones that didn't make it, you can't pretend enough is good enough anymore. The wall keeps us honest. She looked at one plate near the door. The Alden Moore's Grace, just added, failure in the port drive assembly. She'd been through Velic Station 6 weeks before she died. Val recognized the name from his commission file, the ship that had begun all of this. He stood in the room for a very long time. Pauline, who had come with them, stood quietly near the door. After a while she took out her datapad and, without being asked, without explanation, added the Alden Moore's Grace to her own records. Not for the audit, for herself. The investigation was moving toward its conclusion when Commissioner Dreth Ovar arrived. The Mirani were an avian species, bright-plumed, quick-eyed, with a social structure built around formal hierarchy. Commissioner Ovar represented the Galactic Concordate Standards Bureau, and he arrived with all the energy of an institution defending itself before anyone had made an accusation. The statistical variance is a data artifact, he told Val at their first meeting. His plumage was precisely arranged. Classification, inconsistencies between reporting systems, seasonal variation in traffic patterns, self-selection bias in which ships choose to dock here versus certified facilities. We've seen this before, an outlier that appears significant until you correct for confounding variables. I am aware of all those factors, Val said. I have corrected for them. Then your correction methodology requires review. A Class C facility cannot outperform certified standards across 1,400 repairs without commissioner. Val placed the 3 data panes on the table. Pauline's analysis. I need you to look at these. Dreth Ovar looked at them. His plumage shifted. The mortality projection is speculative. The methodology is sound. The methodology assumes commissioner. Val met his eyes. I need you to tell me whether these numbers require a policy response. A long silence. They would require, Ovar said carefully, a very thorough review of how they were generated. Val looked at him. I know what a thorough review of methodology means when a result is inconvenient. He gathered the data panes. I will complete my audit report. It will say what the evidence requires it to say. I would suggest the Bureau prepare for that. Ovar left before dinner. His departure was, Val noted, unusually rapid. Pauline came to Val's quarters that night with a look that in a Suroth archivist meant she had found something that was going to be difficult to contain. She had been working through the Standards Bureau's own internal archives granted access through the Audit Commission's broad authority, and she had found reports, internal reports, commissioned by the Bureau itself, 8 cycles prior, reports that had analyzed the post-repair failure rate across corridor facilities and identified a systemic problem. The minimum tolerances for several common repair procedures were insufficiently conservative. The failure rate at those tolerances was projected at between 4 and 6%. The reports had been reviewed, classified, and filed. No action had been taken. The Bureau had known. Val sat with that information for a while. He was very good at sitting with difficult information. It was part of the skill set the Delvari cultivated, the ability to let data rest in the mind without rushing to conclusions. But this data did not need a long rest. Its conclusion was clear, and it was terrible. Who authored the reports? He asked. Peline named several individuals. Then you are listed as a reviewer on the secondary assessment, Cycle 43. Val closed his eyes. He had reviewed hundreds of internal assessments in Cycle 43. He had reviewed them with the same professional thoroughness he brought to everything. He had trusted the Bureau's process for determining which assessments required escalation and which were resolved at the classification level. He had trusted a process that had, in this instance, decided that 328 lives were an acceptable operational variance. He did not say anything for a long time. Peline waited. The Sarath understood the weight of professional silence. Include everything in the audit record, he said finally. All of it. He found Old Ren the following morning, in the smallest bay, working on a Delvari scout runner that had been in for a minor structural check. Nothing dramatic. Routine maintenance. The human was 78 years old. That much was in the cooperative's personnel records, which Val had read. Former deep space salvage diver. She worked 1 shift per week, the record noted, because she had chosen to. The cooperative could not legally require it. She came anyway. She was working on the scout runner's aft junction panel with her eyes closed, not feeling for vibrations as Tomas Reyes had done, not using a passive scanner, just hands on the panel, eyes closed, breathing steadily. Val watched for several minutes before she opened her eyes, looked at a specific point on the panel, and made a small notation in a physical logbook. Stress point, she said, without looking at him. That seam. Previous repair, maybe 15 years ago. Good repair, whoever did it. But the replacement segment was cast at a slightly lower temperature than the original. Different crystalline structure, still within spec, but under repeated thermal cycling, which this ship's seen a lot of. I can tell from the aft cone coloration. It fatigues faster than the surrounding material. She made another notation. I'd recommend they replace the segment proactively, not urgent. Next scheduled maintenance would be fine. How did you know? Val asked. She looked at him. Her eyes were gray and very calm. 52 years, she said simply. That is not. No, it's not in any manual. She closed the logbook. The manual tells you what to look for. 52 years tells you what to feel for. They're different things. The manual was written by engineers who worked for maybe 20 years before they wrote it. I've learned things since then that the manual doesn't know. She looked at the panel. Every ship teaches you something, if you're paying attention. A lot of people aren't paying attention. They're checking boxes. I stopped checking boxes about 30 years ago. Why do you still come in? Val asked. You are retired. The records indicate. The young ones miss things, she said, not unkindly. Not from laziness, from inexperience. Every ship I look at that they've worked on, I find 1 or 2 things that needed a different eye. I note them. We talk about it. They learn. When I'm not here anymore, they'll look for those things themselves. She paused. The knowledge only lives if you pass it on, and you can only pass on what someone's willing to receive. She picked up her logbook. Your kind, Delvari. Very precise. Good data people. But precise in a documentation way, not a hands-on way. Am I right? Val considered. Largely. She moved to the next section of the panel. Precision is different from care. You can be precise without caring about the outcome. Our best engineers are both. That's the combination that saves lives. Val submitted his initial findings to the Bureau before he was ready to leave. He had not planned to. He had planned to complete the audit, return to the Bureau, file the report through proper channels. That was the process. The process existed for good reasons, to prevent premature conclusions, to allow review, to ensure fairness. He filed early because Commissioner Over had been on communication with Bureau leadership every day since his departure from Cradle Station, and Val had been in institutional settings long enough to understand what daily communications between a commissioner and Bureau leadership meant when an uncomfortable audit was in progress. He filed everything. The failure rate analysis, Peline's mortality projection, the suppressed internal reports from Cycle 43, his own name on the reviewer list, the methodology Cradle Station's engineers used, the memorial wall, Captain Hunter's testimony, Holdren's logbook annotations. He filed it all and sent simultaneous copies to 3 independent galactic news services and the Concordat Transparency Office. Then he went to find Dara Moss. He found her in Bay 3, where she was working alongside 2 engineers on the Holopoint, Captain Hunter's ship, back for its regular maintenance. Dara noticed him and came over, wiping her hands in the way that seemed to be a human gesture of transition from one context to another. "I have completed my primary audit findings," Val said. "I wanted to speak with you before I file formally." All right. He had prepared what he wanted to say. He was a methodical person. He had organized his thoughts. But standing in front of this human woman who had built a place that saved lives because she was still, 30 years later, processing a grief she'd turned into craft, he found that his prepared remarks were inadequate. The Standards Bureau suppressed internal analysis that identified systemic failure rates 8 cycles ago, he said. "I was on the review panel for that analysis. I did not escalate it. I trusted the Bureau's classification process." He paused. "People died because the standards were insufficient, and the standards were not corrected when evidence required it, and I was part of that system." Dara looked at him steadily. "I don't tell you this for absolution," he said. "I tell you because I think you deserve to know that the audit record will say what it needs to say. The Bureau there will be significant institutional consequences. The minimum tolerance standards will be revised. Several internal processes will require overhaul." Dara was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. Not harshly, not with satisfaction, just plainly. "I wanted to ask," Val said, "whether you would be willing to have the cooperative's methods formally documented as a reference model for the revised standards process." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking if we'll tell people how we do what we do?" "Yes, we're not secret about it." She almost smiled. "We never have been. Anyone who's wanted to learn, we've taught. You can document everything. Talk to anyone here. Record whatever you need." She paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. When you go back, when the Bureau changes its standards and rewrites its processes, will they understand why we do this, or just how?" Val considered the question. It was not the question he had expected. "Explain the distinction." "The how is easy to write down. Work beyond the contract. Check twice. Replace the thing that's almost failing, not just the thing that has failed. That's the how. Anybody can follow a checklist." She looked at the memorial wall through the bay door. It was visible from here, just barely. "But the why doesn't fit in a checklist. The why is, every ship is carrying someone's life, someone's future, someone who loves them and is waiting for them to come home. If you remember that, really remember it. Every shift, every coupling you decide is close enough, you make different decisions. The how follows from the why, not the other way around." Val looked at the memorial wall. "I will do my best," he said, "to make the audit report convey both." The changes did not come quickly. They never did, in galactic institutions. The Concordat moved at the pace of a body that had been moving for 300 years and had internalized caution as a virtue, but they came. The minimum tolerance standards for 14 common repair procedures were revised upward within 18 months of Val's report. The revision was contested, delayed, debated in 7 committee hearings, and opposed strenuously by several major certified facilities whose cost models depended on the existing tolerances. It passed anyway. Because Pellen's mortality projection had been independently verified by 2 separate academic institutions. Because Captain Una testified before the Concordat Review Board and said quietly that she would have died in the Narrow, and her 12 crewmates with her, and that within acceptable tolerances was a phrase she would never again read without thinking about what it meant to be the person for whom the tolerance was being accepted. Because commander-equivalent officers from 4 different species filed formal letters noting that their ships had been repaired at both certified standard facilities and at Cradle Station, and asking the Concordat to explain in specific terms why the survival rates were so different. Because the Alden Moore's grace was on the wall, and someone had made sure that name was in every news report, every committee hearing, every public submission, not as a weapon, as a memorial, as a reminder of what the gap between enough and right actually looked like in human terms. The Bureau did not collapse. Institutions rarely did, but it changed in the ways institutions change when external pressure is sustained, and the evidence is too clear to dismiss. Commissioner Over retired. New protocols for escalating internal assessments were implemented. A formal review process for safety-critical analysis was established with mandatory external oversight. Cradle Station's waiting list grew to 8 months. Ships rerouted. Not all of them, not immediately. But word moved through the corridor networks the way reputation always moves, through trust, through specificity, through the particular kind of recommendation that comes not from advertising but from a captain telling another captain, "I owe them my life, go there." A Delvari cargo runner, whose engineer had found a stress fracture in the aft junction panel the one old Wren had noted, sent a message months later. The fracture had been confirmed by independent analysis. The repair had been completed. The ship had run 3 full route cycles without incident. The message said in the formal register of Delvari communication, "We understand now what you meant by care. We are still learning how to mean it ourselves." A Sarath research vessel came through with a damaged sensor array. Its archivist, a methodical individual with 20 years of data experience, spent a shift working alongside old Wren in the small bay. He did not say much. Wren did not say much. At the end of the shift he asked if he could come back. She told him the same thing she told everyone. "If you're willing to pay attention." He came back for 6 months, took what he learned back to his ship and to his people, and began teaching. The Keth Maritime Guild Captain Una's people formally recommended Cradle Station to all guild members operating in the tertiary corridor. The recommendation cited the survival data, but in the body of the document, someone had included a single additional line, not from the data, not from any formal testimony. They remember the ships they couldn't save. This is worth noting. Soren Val returned to Cradle Station 14 months after his audit. Not on a commission, not on official bureau business. He arrived on a personal transport, with a single bag, and presented himself to the cooperative's administrative terminal with a formal request that was, for a former auditor magistrate of the Galactic Concordat, remarkably simple. He wanted an apprenticeship, not to study, not to audit, not to document. He had spent 30 years doing those things and doing them well, and they had not been enough, and he had spent 14 months understanding exactly why. Dara read the request twice. Then she came down to the bay where his transport had docked and looked at him for a moment with the direct load-bearing assessment he remembered. "You know you'll start at the bottom," she said. "You'll be doing basic material checks and hull inspections for probably a year before you're useful. I am aware. You'll be taking instruction from engineers half your age. Also aware." Why? He had thought about how to answer this. He had several answers prepared, about standards reform, about institutional change, about the practical value of hands-on understanding for regulatory work. All of them were true. None of them were the complete truth. "Because I reviewed a report 8 years ago," he said, "and trusted the process to determine whether it needed escalation, and the process determined it did not, and people died." He looked at his 6-fingered hands. "I have spent 30 years counting things. I would like to spend some time learning to feel them." Dara Moss looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "You'll start in Bay 4. There's a Delvari scout runner in for routine inspection. I'll introduce you to Tomas. He'll show you what we're looking at." She turned and walked toward the bay. After a moment, Val followed. The Alden Moore's Grace remained on the wall. The plate beside it, added 3 months after the audit, read, 17 aboard. They came home because the curve changed. We remember. Old Wren added a new ship every time she learned of one. She was methodical about it. She carved each name herself. An old human craft. She explained to anyone who asked, called woodworking, adapted for metal, because the physical act of making the memorial with her hands was different from entering a name in a database. "Your hands know what your mind is doing," she said. "If you're carving a name, you can't be doing anything else." The wall grew, not because more ships were failing. The failure rates across the corridor continued to decline as the revised standards took hold, but because Wren reached backward through records and added the ones that should always have been there. The ships that had died to acceptable tolerances. The crews who had trusted the numbers. She would have kept going until the wall ran out of space, except that they extended the wall twice, and she kept going. There was a quality to the work at Cradle Station that observers consistently noted but struggled to describe precisely. It was not speed. It was not state-of-the-art equipment. It was not any specific technique that could be isolated and replicated through documentation. A Theon engineer. The Theon were a species of considerable logical precision, generally skeptical of qualitative assessments, came through on a trade mission 2 years after the audit, and spent 4 days at the cooperative at her own request. Her report to the Theon Institute of Technical Excellence was cited for decades afterward. The facility in question does not operate by superior methods in any technically definable sense, she wrote. Their equipment is adequate. Their procedures are largely standard. Their documentation practices are in several areas insufficiently formalized. And yet the work is better. This requires explanation. After extended observation, I believe the difference is this. At most repair facilities, the work is understood as the application of known solutions to identified problems. At the Cradle Cooperative, the work is understood as a relationship between the engineer and the vessel, a relationship in which the engineer's role is not merely to fix what is broken, but to understand what the vessel needs. This may appear to be a semantic distinction. It is not. It changes the questions the engineer asks. It changes what they notice. It changes what they choose to record and what they choose to do about it. When you are fixing a problem, you stop when the problem is fixed. When you are caring for a vessel, you stop when you believe the vessel is safe. I cannot reduce this to a procedural standard. I am not certain it can be reduced, but I believe it can be taught, not through documentation, but through proximity to people who practice it for long enough that the habit of relationship becomes natural. This is perhaps humanity's most significant contribution to engineering, not as a discipline, but as a practice. The galaxy changed slowly. It always did. The Concordat's revised standards were a beginning, not an ending. The memorial at Cradle Station grew. The waiting list fluctuated. New engineers came to apprentice, some from far systems, some from species that had, not long ago, viewed human facilities as an eccentric outlier not worth serious consideration. Old Wren kept coming in on her shift. The young engineers kept finding things they had missed, under her guidance, and noting them in logs that were increasingly crowded with the kind of observation that no scanner produced and no manual contained. Thomas Reyes's dry humor became, over the years, a kind of informal teaching method. He had a gift for explaining a complex diagnostic in terms that made it feel obvious, and engineers who had worked with him for a season tended to carry his particular way of asking questions about a ship for the rest of their careers. What's it telling you? What does it want to be? What's the sound it makes when everything's right, and what's the sound it makes now, and what's the difference? Dara Moss continued to run the cooperative. She continued to wipe her hands on a cloth that was never quite white. She continued to assess newcomers with the load-bearing look, determining what they were made of, and what they would need to learn. She added plates to the wall herself, sometimes, the ones that hit closest, the ships she had known, the captains she had talked with, the crews whose faces she could picture. She did not speak of this often. It was not the kind of thing she spoke of. But the plates were always the most carefully made, the lettering deepest cut, the metal most precisely finished, the edges smoothed until they were almost kind under the hand. It was, Val observed once, the best craftsmanship in the building. Of course, she said, and went back to work. Ambassador T-Vex of the Galactic Concordat visited Cradle Station in the 3rd year after the audit. She had been one of the senior delegates who had reviewed Val's report, and she had been among those who pushed hardest for the standards revision. She came, she said, to understand what she had been defending. Dara gave her the same tour she gave everyone. The bays, the crews, the records room, and at the end the wall. T-Vex stood before the wall for a long time. Her 3 eyes moved from plate to plate, reading names she did not recognize, understanding what they meant. This is grief, she said finally. Organized grief. It's memory, Dara said. Grief is what you feel. Memory is what you do with it. T-Vex turned to look at her. In most cultures, memory of loss is a private matter, or a ceremonial one. You have made it structural, architectural. We made it visible, Dara said. So we can't forget it. We made it visible, Dara said. So new engineers see it on their first day and understand what this place is for. It's not for contracts. It's not for revenue. It's for that. She gestured at the wall. For making sure those names don't keep getting new company from something preventable. T-Vex looked at the wall again. At the Alden Moore's Grace. At the line below it, 17 aboard. They came home because the curve changed. We remember. The Concordat, she said slowly, has been in existence for 300 years. It has accumulated vast institutional knowledge. It has processed more data on transit safety than any other body in the galaxy. She paused. It does not have a room like this. No, Dara said. Perhaps it should. Dara was quiet for a moment. The room doesn't matter. The room is just so you can't pretend. It's so every person who works here has to walk past it every day and know what the work is actually for. She looked at T-Vex. You can build a room like this anywhere. The harder part is making sure the people inside the institution understand what it means. That the numbers in the failure rate reports are not numbers. They are the Alden Moore's Grace. They are 17 people who packed their bags 6 weeks before and were looking forward to making port. T-Vizic's expression was something Val, standing nearby, would later describe in his personal notes as the look of an institution encountering its own conscience. I understand, the ambassador said. And then, after a pause, how do we learn to do this? Not the technical standards. This. Dara looked at her with the load-bearing gaze. You start, she said, by letting yourself remember. Soren Val completed his first full year of apprenticeship in the spring of the 4th year. He had done what he was told: material checks, hull inspections, the unglamorous inventory of foundational work that experienced engineers often overlooked. Because they had done it so many times it became invisible. He had also found things, not many. 3 in a year. Small things, the kind that showed up in the gap between a scanner reading and a trained sense of wrongness that he was slowly, painstakingly developing. He reported each one with more care than he had brought to audit reports covering hundreds of facilities, because these 3 things were not data points. They were stories with people in them. Tomas Reyes signed off on his annual review with a note that Val preserved in his personal records. Good eye developing, better ear. Still trusts the scanner too much. Keep working. It was, Val thought, the finest professional review he had ever received. The galaxy does not change the way stories say it does, all at once in a single dramatic moment, legible to everyone. It changes the way metal fatigues and recovers and fatigues again, in cycles too small to observe individually, until the day when an engineer puts their hand on a surface, and it feels different from how it felt before. But the direction of change at Cradle Station was clear enough. Clear in the ships that rerouted, in the apprentices who came and stayed, in the standards that were written and rewritten towards something more like right and less like enough. Clear in the Delvari auditor who spent his 2nd apprenticeship year learning to diagnose crystalline stress in hull alloys by the feel of the metal under his 6 careful fingers. Clear in the wall which grew and was not only loss. The plates were loss, but the space around them, the bay beyond the door, the crews moving in it, the ships in stages of repair, the particular organized chaos that somehow produced excellence, that was the answer to the wall. That was what the wall was for, not grief, kept and maintained and visited. Grief, made into work, held in careful hands, pressed into the seams of ships, sent back out into the dark with people inside them who did not know that the hands that touched their vessel had been touched by loss first, and had made something from it. The ships flew, not all of them, not always. The void was vast and indifferent, and there were still fractures that went undetected, and systems that failed at the worst possible moment, and all the particular cruelties that the universe dispensed without malice and without mercy, but fewer, measurably fewer. The kind of fewer that showed up in data panes and audit reports and mortality projections, the kind that a methodical Delvari with 30 years of counting things could point to and say, here, in this gap between the average and the outlier, in this difference between acceptable and right, here is what care looks like, expressed numerically. And in the small bay, in the week's single shift that was all old Wren worked, in the hand laid on a panel, and the eyes closed, and the listening that had no name in any manual, here too was what it looked like, expressed in a different kind of language, one that took longer to learn and could not be transmitted through a data pull, or a certification review, or a committee hearing, one that moved instead from hand to hand. If you have carried something you loved for a long time, through repair and damage, and repair again, you understand something that the Galactic Concordat statistics could never quite contain. Tools do not know they are loved. Ships do not feel the hands that work on them, but the people in them do. They come home or they don't. They fly safe, or the fracture completes in the dark. And somewhere on a wall in a converted ore processing platform on the edge of a transit corridor that most ships fly through without stopping, there is a plate with a name on it, carved by hand, smoothed to something close to kindness. They knew, they remember. The ships keep flying. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want to explore more stories about what humans look like from the outside, stay close. The next one asks a different kind of question. What happens when an alien civilization meets a human behavior they cannot classify as either warfare or mercy, and they have to invent a new category for what they're seeing?